knows every shadow like a lover's name. Her steps a rhythm, a deadly game. Fingers chase the edge of time. She rewrites the world, one line at a time.
Chapter 3: The Monsoon Run. The ferry to Goa departed from Mumbai's lesser-known commercial docks, a realm of rusted cargo ships, dented bollards, and questionable maritime certifications, far removed from the city's tourist-friendly passenger terminals. Here, the concrete was cracked and stained with old oil spills. The water below churned with floating debris and rainbow sheens of fuel, and the air smelled of salt, diesel, and the tired resignation of men who worked odd hours for cash. Yellow sodium lamps painted everything in a sickly glow. Cargo nets swung on creaking cranes as stevedores shouted in Marathi and Konkani, their voices carrying across the damp night air. Somewhere, a radio played a faint, distorted film song, the melody swallowed intermittently by the grinding whine of winches and the clank of metal on metal. Ananya stood at the railing of the upper deck as the vessel eased away from the pier with a shuddering groan. The hull cut through the Arabian Sea's midnight swells, the bow rising and falling with slow, deliberate effort, as if the ship itself had to think about every movement. Spray slapped against the metal, scattering into the humid air as fine droplets. Her silhouette merged into the fog that rose off the water like exhaled breath from a living ocean. Mist swirled around her, dampening her hair, softening the hard lines of her face. She kept her hands loose on the railing, her stance slightly broader than that of a casual traveler, body unconsciously adjusted for balance and sudden motion. The monsoon had arrived early this year, ignoring the neat boundaries of weather models and agricultural calendars. Banks of dense cloud draped themselves over the sea, blotting out the stars and the crescent moon. Lightning flickered far in the distance, silent behind thick curtains of rain that drifted across the horizon in layered veils. The line between ocean and sky was almost gone. The world had reduced itself to shades of black and charcoal, occasionally torn open by streaks of electric white on the horizon. She welcomed the obscurity. Satellite surveillance struggled with heavy monsoon cloud stacks. Optical systems lost resolution. Infrared signatures blurred under the constant turbulence of cold and warm air masses colliding. Even synthetic aperture radar, with all its supposed weather-agnostic capabilities, produced noisier data over violently churning seas. No constellation of foreign eyes in orbit would be getting clean images of this aging ferry tonight. The vessel's navigation system was as antiquated as the rest of it, an aging radar display with a faint green sweep, a GPS module that occasionally lost its fix, and an AIS transponder broadcasting the bare minimum required by maritime law: vessel ID, position, course, speed. No integration with passenger identity databases, no biometric boarding gates, no automated passenger lists feeding back to national grid systems. Just a steel hull, a questionable engine, and a human crew whose primary concerns were fuel costs and avoiding collisions. Exactly what she needed. She had paid cash to a dock supervisor whose shirt bore the logo of a contracted shipping agency and whose eyes flickered briefly to the side before accepting her money. He had looked at the notes, not at her face. Years of petty corruption had trained him to focus on the object, not the person. He counted, nodded once, and pointed toward the side gangway used for loading unscheduled passengers and cargo. She joined a cluster of migrant workers, returning home for the harvest season, men with canvas bags tied at the handles, women with plastic suitcases and children wrapped in shawls, old men carrying metal tiffin carriers and rolled-up blankets. Their clothes were worn but neat, their faces lined with fatigue and small hope. No one questioned the presence of one more tired-looking woman in a simple kurta and dupatta, carrying a satchel and a small backpack. Her corporate blazer was gone. Her hair, braided and coiled, made her look like a schoolteacher or a junior accountant. She kept her head slightly bowed when she passed under the two dome cameras above the gangway, turning just enough that her features showed only in half profile. If those cameras even recorded properly, the footage would be grainy, splattered with raindrops, and stored on a hard drive that might be overwritten by next week's trips. She had chosen the ferry over the train or road routes for 3 reasons. No Aadhaar verification, no integrated ticketing systems tied to centralized databases, and no automated face tagging algorithms running on every platform. At sea, between Mumbai and Goa, India's digital omnipresence thinned to a handful of transponders and some bored Coast Guard radar operators watching green blips drift across their screens. In 6 hours, assuming the sea didn't turn vicious enough to force the captain into a holding pattern, she would reach Goa's northern coast. From there, the vectors multiplied. She could vanish inland through the forests of the Western Ghats, catch a late-night bus toward Karnataka's interior, or take a calculated risk through an airport using forged credentials. She could even arrange a coastal hop further south if the right fishing trawler captain could be persuaded. But those were tactical questions. First, she needed strategic clarity. She needed to know what exactly she had walked into and what was now chasing her across 2 continents. She stayed by the railing until the dock lights became a smear of amber on the horizon, diluted by rain and distance. Behind that smear lay Mumbai, Bandra-Kurla's mirrored towers, Raw's hidden nodes, and a tightening net of surveillance searching for a woman who was no longer where the data said she should be. The wind picked up, driving cold droplets into her face. The ferry's horn sounded, a long, low moan that vibrated through the deck plates like a giant sigh. She let herself feel that vibration, then turned away and headed down toward the lower cargo deck. The hatch to the hold was propped open with a dented metal wedge. Inside, the air was warmer, heavier, saturated with the smell of diesel exhaust, wet rope, fish residue, and human bodies. The ceiling was low, crisscrossed with beams and cable runs. Cargo crates, sacks of grain, and stacked plastic drums were lashed down in uneven grids with thick ropes that creaked with each shift of the ship. Workers had claimed whatever space remained. Some sat against crates, knees drawn up. Others had spread thin mats or blankets and lay in awkward angles, already half asleep despite the ship's motion. Children clung to parents or lay sprawled with the boneless abandon of exhaustion. Someone had lit incense near a small shrine improvised on top of a crate, the faint sandalwood scent fighting a losing battle against oily fumes. Ananya found an unclaimed patch of deck near a bulkhead, wedged between a stack of rice sacks and a low metal shelf holding coils of rope. She sat down cross-legged, back against the bulkhead, satchel resting on her lap. The ship rolled gently beneath her, the occasional sharper tilt making a few loose objects slide a centimeter or 2 before settling. She blended in, just another quiet traveler keeping to herself. Her tablet sat snug in the Faraday-lined sleeve of her satchel. She glanced around once, scanning faces, noting positions, making sure no one seemed particularly interested in her. Most eyes were half-shuttered by fatigue or fixed on nothing. Satisfied, she unzipped the satchel and pulled the tablet out, cradling it against her knees, screen angled away from any direct line of sight. Before leaving Mumbai, she had scrubbed the device clean, wiping logs, disabling radios, rerouting identifiers, then shifted the critical malware samples and trace fragments into the neural vault, a hardware-encrypted enclave carved into the tablet's architecture by Raw's tech division. It was designed to survive physical destruction of the main system, to resist remote wipes, and to render any unauthorized decryption attempt not just difficult, but computationally insane. Now, in the dim cargo hold, the tablet might as well have been a simple e-reader to anyone glancing in her direction. Only she knew that behind its blank-looking interface lived the most dangerous code she had ever seen. She powered it up in fully offline mode. No Bluetooth, no Wi-Fi, no cellular handshake. It was an island of silicon in a sea of analog motion. Lines of numbers and filters greeted her. She authenticated into the vault, her fingers moving through a sequence of gestures that would mean nothing to someone else. A choreography of taps and swipes over a seemingly innocent home screen. The neural vault's interface opened as a simple text console, devoid of flourish. She called up the first captured payload. The code she'd extracted from Ananta export systems told a story more disturbing the deeper she read. Operation Leverage wasn't a blunt tool aimed at a single node of India's trade infrastructure. It was a distributed architecture designed to create cascading failure while wearing the mask of systemic weakness. On the surface, it was a series of plugins and optimization modules embedded in off-the-shelf supply chain and compliance software. third-party tools sold as efficiency enhancers to logistics firms, export houses, and customs brokers. Each module claimed to streamline invoicing, automate tax calculations, or reconcile shipment data across multiple ports. Beneath the smiling interface sat embedded routines that manipulated import cost calculations by fractions of percent at precisely chosen moments. The code introduced random delays in clearance for certain classes of goods, flagged others as high risk to trigger manual inspections, and quietly misrouted critical notifications. The targets weren't random categories. Pharmaceuticals dependent on active ingredients sourced from Chinese factories, textile machinery spare parts reliant on European manufacturers, semiconductor-grade components from Taiwan, high-value agrochemicals used in states where political unrest could easily be stoked by crop failures and price spikes. Each disruption, on its own, was minor. A shipment held an extra 2 days at Nava Sheva due to a routine compliance check. A container of machine parts diverted to a secondary port because of a misaligned code. A batch of API ingredients forced into retesting by a parameter mismatch. Isolated anomalies, reasonable, explainable. Aggregated across months, mapped across multiple nodes, they formed a lattice of pressure points calibrated to inflict reputational damage. When the inevitable disruptions bled into consumer reality, the story told by the data would be simple and damning. India's supply chains were unreliable, its regulations inconsistent, its business environment unpredictable. Investors hate unpredictability more than they hate risk. Risk can be priced, chaos cannot. She saw routines meant to blindside regulatory watchdogs as well. Data export modules embedded false positives in some places and omitted real ones in others. On paper, some sectors would look healthier than they were, a false sense of security. In others, the picture would be so muddled that no clear policy correction could be crafted without playing into the attacker's hands. The entire architecture was built to maintain plausible deniability. If, or when, prices spiked and shelves emptied, when factories complained of missing parts and hospitals scrambled for certain drugs, the dominant narrative would not be "we are under attack." It would be India mismanaged its growth, India overreached, India chose the wrong allies. Unstable business environment, risky alignment with Russian energy interests, weak institutional capacity. Rhetoric she had heard before in policy circles and think tank seminars, where polite voices disguised strategic hostility. Economic warfare disguised as market forces. Her jaw clenched as she scrolled deeper through the code fragments, tracing back the call chains and obfuscation layers that disguised command and control instructions as innocuous requests to ad servers and cloud analytics platforms. She recognized the skeleton beneath the disguise, the architectural cadence of Ghost Torch, the NSA's modular infiltration suite, but twisted, inverted, recontextualized into something more insidious. 3 weeks earlier, Washington had announced a 50% tariff on Indian steel and textiles, wrapped in the language of protecting domestic workers and ensuring fair competition. The move had been telegraphed for months through diplomatic channels, leaks, and strategic leaks disguised as journalist scoops. That kind of economic punch was heavy, but predictable. Operation Leverage was the blade pressed between the ribs when everyone was watching the fist. This was leverage in its purest form, manufactured crisis to force a policy retreat. A slow, orchestrated erosion aimed at nudging India away from the energy deals that New Delhi and Moscow had stitched together to bypass Western sanctions regimes. Her tablet vibrated softly in her hands, a tactile pulse, not tied to any network, triggered only by pre-agreed processes. A new encrypted block awaited inside the vault. Priority, Volkov. She opened it. Architectural analysis confirms NSA-derived toolset, repurposed by contractor network operating under ODNI oversight. Target profile matches India's continued crude oil imports from Rosneft despite Western sanctions. Your exposure has accelerated their timeline. They will attempt to execute final phase within 72 hours, targeting Bombay Stock Exchange core infrastructure and petroleum payment gateways. Recommend immediate coordination. Moscow prepared to provide technical countermeasures through BRICS intelligence sharing protocols. Response? Almost academic in its language. Volkov didn't waste characters on pleasantries. The key phrases: contractor network, ODNI oversight, Rosneft imports, BSE core, petroleum gateways, unwound in her mind like a thread, connecting the dots faster than any whiteboard in a conference room ever could. She imagined the architecture: Western intelligence services filtering their most sensitive operations through contractor ecosystems that could be disavowed if exposed. Coders sitting in anonymous office parks outside Washington or London or in some tax-advantaged jurisdiction, writing weaponized optimization tools under the umbrella of innocuous consulting firms. Plausible deniability wrapped in non-disclosure agreements. Target selection aligned almost perfectly with India's defiance of sanctions. New Delhi's insistence on maintaining crude oil imports from Rosneft and settling payments via alternative channels had irritated policymakers from Brussels to Washington. Publicly, they spoke of deep concern. Privately, they activated tools like this. And now, because Ananya had tripped their mechanism earlier than they'd planned, because she had quarantined part of the malware and yanked a thread, she had accelerated their timeline. Something that might have unfolded quietly over months would now aim to deliver a visible shock within 72 hours. Bombay Stock Exchange core infrastructure, petroleum payment gateways. That combination wasn't random. The BSE was more than an iconic building in Mumbai's financial district. It was a symbolic heartbeat of India's markets. Even a temporary disruption of its core systems, even if resolved within hours, would send ripples through global trading desks. Combine that with simultaneous failures at key petroleum payment gateways, where crude purchases, refinery settlements, and fuel distribution payments flowed, and the narrative would write itself. India's economy buckled under its own digital fragility. Her mind ticked through layers of consequences: trading halts, margin calls, liquidity crunch, media headlines, politicians demanding scapegoats, external pressure groups offering support in exchange for reforms. She could see the shape of the trap clearly now. The ferry rocked on a larger wave, making a few of the sleeping passengers mumble and shift. A baby cried briefly, then quieted when its mother murmured something and adjusted the blanket. Ananya stared at Volkov's message for several long seconds, feeling the weight of options settle on her like wet cloth. Collaboration with Russian intelligence would brand her, in certain circles of New Delhi's establishment, as a traitor, or at best as someone reckless enough to cross bright red lines. Those circles included people who already saw her as a threat, as evidenced by how easily they'd move to frame and detain her when she got too close to the wrong anomaly. Refusing Moscow's offer meant facing Operation Leverage essentially alone. Raw's institutional support was compromised. Internal oversight had either been manipulated or was complicit. Even if there were pockets of integrity left, and she believed there were, they would be hamstrung by false narratives and doctored logs. Geopolitics, she knew better than most, had no room for ideological purity. The real game was played in gradients of gray, measured in trade-offs and calculated betrayals. She thought briefly of Lodi Road, the main RAW headquarters in Delhi. The manicured lawns, the layers of security, the conference rooms where she had once argued about cyber doctrine and defensive posture. She thought of Colonel Menin's warning about internal threats. She thought of the woman in the charcoal suit at Ananta Exports and how quickly that team had mobilized against her. Trust in this landscape could no longer be anchored to flags. It had to be anchored to patterns of behavior, to historical precedent, to outcomes. Moscow's interests here were not altruistic. Protecting the energy corridor with India protected Russia's own economic flank. The BRICS intelligence sharing protocols, lauded in press releases and white papers, had always been undermined by suspicion and competitive paranoia. But when a shared threat pressed hard enough, even reluctant partners found ways to cooperate. She typed her response slowly, every word a deliberate step. Agreed. Require immediate threat intelligence on leverage infrastructure, server locations, personnel networks, execution timeline. Will pursue upstream disruption while maintaining operational independence. Secure channel protocols? She hesitated over operational independence, then left it. She needed Volkov's help, but she could not become an extension of Russian policy. She sent the message, The Volt's interface swallowed it, compressing and encrypting it before marking it as queued for burst relay. The tablet would push the data through when it next came within range of a safe node or via carefully masked piggyback on a broadcast network. The reply arrived faster than she expected, seconds, not minutes. Either Volkov was awake and watching the channel in real time, or she had set an automated triage system to flag Ananya's unique handshake. Geneva. Neutral ground. Trade compliance conference begins in 48 hours. Multiple shell consultancies attending. Perfect cover for operational liaison. Credentials and contact protocols uploading now. Welcome to the Real Alliance, Agent Rao. A small icon flickered as attachment packets loaded into the vault. Documents, cover identities, access badges for the upcoming conference. She didn't open them yet. The broad strokes were enough. Geneva. 48 hours. Trade compliance. Shell consultancies. The words Real Alliance lingered in her thoughts like the afterimage of a bright screen. The Real Alliance. Not the official partnerships announced with choreographed smiles at diplomatic summits. Not the bilateral dialogues with flags on table stands and journalists taking notes. The Real Alliance was the shadow web of professionals who understood that, beneath ideology and rhetoric, there were structural threats that could break entire regions if left unchecked. On one side, Western agencies willing to weaponize interdependence. On another, states like India and Russia trying to navigate between dependency and autonomy. In the middle, people like her and Volkov, who understood code better than slogans. She allowed herself the ghost of a smile, one that never reached her eyes. It vanished almost as soon as it appeared. Geneva would be a different battlefield entirely. Carpeted floors, controlled temperatures, translation headsets, and the quiet warfare of false consultancy fronts. But before she could even think of that, she had to survive the rough edges of the next 48 hours. Raw's reach extended far beyond Mumbai. Immigration databases, airline reservation systems, hotel bookings, any of them could light up with her profile once the right watch flag was triggered. The ferry's horn sounded again, this time shorter. Above, she heard footsteps on metal and muffled shouts, the crew adjusting course markers as they moved further down the coast. She closed the vault, returned the tablet to its innocuous front, then powered it down fully. Silence filled the small rectangle as the screen went dark. She slipped it back into the satchel, securing the zipper and pulling the bag against her body in a way that made it look like a simple pillow for sleep. For a moment, she simply sat, feeling the motion of the ship roll through her. A small boy nearby stared at her curiously, thumb half in his mouth. His eyes were wide, unbothered by the moving shadows. She met his gaze briefly, then softened her expression, giving the smallest nod. He blinked and turned to burrow against the arm of the woman next to him. His mother, likely, who slept with her back to a crate, head tilted uncomfortably. Ananya shifted, adjusting her posture so that her silhouette looked less alert. An awake, watchful adult attracted unnecessary attention. A tired traveler trying to rest did not. She tilted her head back against the bulkhead and let her eyes half close. She did not sleep, but she allowed her brain to slip into the lighter state between full focus and rest, a tactical drift where noise filtered, patterns remained, and the body conserved energy. Her mind wandered briefly, unbidden, to the first time she'd seen the sea like this. Years ago, before she joined Raw, she had traveled with college friends to Goa during a monsoon break. They had stayed in a cheap guest house with peeling paint and a temperamental generator. At night, they'd walked on the beach under a sky as dark as this one, waves crashing against the shore with the same relentless persistence. Back then, the ocean had felt like freedom, an open horizon. Now it felt like a buffer zone, a temporary blind spot in a world that had learned to map and monetize every movement. Time blurred. The ferry continued its steady, imperfect progress southward, sometimes rising on the back of a larger wave, sometimes slapping down harder than comfort allowed. Each jolt made a few people stir, mutter, or tighten their grip on whatever they held. At some point, a crewman came through the hold with a metal container of sweet, milky tea and small steel cups. He offered them to those who were awake, moving with the practiced efficiency of someone who had done this run too many times to count. When he reached her, she accepted a cup with a grateful nod. The tea was too sweet and too hot, but it warmed her from the inside, chasing away some of the chill that had settled into her shoulders. "First time?" the crewman asked casually, in Hindi tinged with coastal accent. "On this route," she said. "Not exactly a lie. Sea is rough this week," he said, glancing toward the closed hatch as if he could see the waves through it. "Captain says Monsoon is angry, but our ship is stubborn. She doesn't like to stop." "Good," Ananya said. "Stopping would be worse." He chuckled and moved on, distributing tea to a group of men, playing cards on an overturned crate. She finished her tea, set the empty cup aside, and checked the slim watch she'd replaced her corporate smartwatch with. A cheap, analog dial bought from a roadside vendor near the docks. 2 hours had passed since departure. 4 more if the captain's optimism outmatched the sea only slightly. Eventually, she forced herself to close her eyes fully. Not sleep, exactly, but a deeper trance. She filtered sounds, the constant engine hum, the occasional louder creak of metal, someone's soft snoring, a whispered conversation about a cousin's wedding in a village near Belgaum. Her body conserved energy. Her mind continued to process the variables. If Operation Leverage's final phase was scheduled within 72 hours, and if Geneva's conference began in 48, that left a narrow window for positioning. She would need to get off this ferry without encountering a checkpoint tied into national grid systems, reach a location with enough connectivity to send a controlled burst of data to Volkov, and receive updates, secure a travel identity that could withstand airport scrutiny, fly out of India without tripping Raw's watch lists. Each of those steps carried non-trivial risk. Any misstep could end with her in a sealed interrogation room under Lodi Road, her every word recorded and dissected by people who might already be compromised. The ship's horn sounded again, closer this time to shore. The pitch was different, short, functional, less mournful. She opened her eyes. The cargo hold was brighter by a few degrees. Light seeped in from gaps in the hatch, tinged with gray. The motion of the ship had changed subtly. The swells felt narrower, choppier, suggesting they were moving closer to land, where currents broke differently. Around her, people stirred. Someone checked a cloth bag, counting something inside. A woman adjusted her sari and combed her hair with her fingers. 2 teenagers argued quietly about who would carry which bag when they disembarked. Ananya rose smoothly, stretching her legs to disguise the deliberate scan of her surroundings. She slid the satchel strap across her body, snug between shoulder and hip. Her kurta and dupatta were slightly crumpled from sleep, but that only helped the disguise of ordinary travel. She made her way toward the narrow stair leading up to the main deck. The air grew cooler and fresher as she climbed, the smell of fuel fumes replaced by wet wind and salt. On the upper deck, rain had lessened to a fine, persistent drizzle. Low clouds still pressed overhead, but the darkness had softened from deep black to a murky blue-gray. Through the mist, she saw distant lights flickering against the horizon, scattered clusters marking the coastline and port approaches. The ferry's horn blared once more as they approached Goa's coastal markers. Buoys bobbed in the swells, lights blinking in predetermined patterns to guide ships along safe channels. Ananya moved to the starboard rail, taking in the approaching shore. The outlines of low hills emerged first, then the faint suggestions of palms and rooftops. Here and there, stronger lights spilled from structures closer to the water. Warehouses, small ports, private jetties. Officially, the ferry would dock at a modest, commercial terminal, a place used by goods carriers and laborers, not tourists in beachwear. Unofficially, such terminals were perfect for slipping through with minimal scrutiny. She adjusted the dupatta over her shoulders, covering more of her hair, making herself look slightly older, less distinctive. The simple cotton clung damply to her arms. Her satchel felt heavier than before. It wasn't the weight of the tablet or the few clothes she carried. It was the density of what those items represented. Evidence of a silent war, an invitation to a different kind of alliance, a target drawn on her back by people powerful enough to erase identities with a keystroke. She stepped away from the rail as crew members began shouting instructions to passengers in Konkani and Hindi, guiding them toward the disembarkation area. Ropes were prepared. The sound of engines shifted in pitch as the captain adjusted power. Inside her satchel, the tablet remained inert, but the coordinates Volkov had sent to her earlier pulsed in her mind as if they emanated their own signal. Geneva, Neutral ground that was never truly neutral. Trade compliance conference, with shell consultancies orbiting it like parasites. 48 hours. Between this deck and that conference hall lay immigration counters, airline manifests, hotel registrations, and a dozen points where a name or a face could trip an alert. She moved with the flow of passengers toward the lower gangway. The ferry's hull kissed the dock with a muted thump. Ropes were thrown, caught, looped over bollards. A metal ramp was extended and lowered with a grinding sound. Port workers in faded uniforms stood ready, clipboards in hand for cargo checks, not caring much about the passengers streaming past them unless something looked immediately wrong. That was the key. Not to look wrong. On the dock, the monsoon rain intensified again, drumming against metal and concrete in a relentless staccato. It blurred edges, softened lines, made everything look less precise. Cameras up on light poles collected footage of figures under umbrellas and wrapped in plastic sheeting, their faces turned down. Ananya stepped onto the ramp with the others, the ship's bulk looming behind her. She inhaled once, air rich with land smells now, a mix of wet earth, vegetation, and industrial residue, and exhaled slowly as she crossed the threshold. Behind her, the city she had fled glowed somewhere far up the coast, a constellation of artificial light that would soon be searching for her with algorithmic precision, combing through records and feeds to reconstruct her path. Ahead lay only dark water fading behind her, the uncertain shore beneath her feet, and a narrow path, measured not in kilometers but in hours and decisions. She stepped off the ramp onto the dock, her sandals splashing in shallow puddles, and did not hesitate.
Her eyes burn cold, her touch ignites. She's the heartbeat in the dead of night. She's